Hello everybody, Newbornkilik here, welcoming you back to another awesome Zelda Theory, or rather I should say, the following is kind of like a train of thought that I had one day without a whole lot of proof, but I was just trying to make a theory about the ReDeads because I did get a lot of feedback and some very interesting opinions about maybe what the ReDead are in the last video that I did about the ReDead, so I kind of wanted to share that with all of you, but I couldn't really come up with any proof or anything, so it's less of a theory and more of a train of thought, some hypotheses about, the idea that the ReDead are made of clay. So if you have any ideas, feel free to let me know in the comments below, but please bear in mind there's going to be very little proof to any of this. It's kind of using logic and real-world experience to narrow down some of the darker sides of the ReDead and what they might be. So, let's get right into it. The ReDead are said to be made of clay according to Nintendo, which is an obvious retcon to their horrifically messed up enemy design, but I did kind of want to take a moment and kind of maybe think that the ReDeads actually are made of clay, and kind of think of the darker sides of that and some of the implications that might, imply if the ReDeads actually were made of clay. And please bear in mind that some of these did come from the comments below, and I'll try my best to acknowledge those ideas as not mine, but if I miss them, I do apologize. So one of the ideas that I kind of like was that maybe being bound in clay was kind of supposed to be sort of a punishment. You'd have your hands bound behind you or something, you'd be bound in clay, and then these spooky masks, basically these ReDead masks, would be placed on your face to basically mark you as a criminal. Now this wouldn't really do a whole lot in application, just surrounding yourself in clay, other than make your skin look fabulous, to be completely honest, because, certain types of clay are used for skin exfoliation, so, hey, maybe they just wanted to give them a nice spa treatment, but then we get to think about what may have happened if this clay were actually fired in a kiln. Now, that's where things get a little bit interesting, because if they were fired in a kiln and, their hands were bound, there's nothing saying that, a prisoner would have the strength to break free. But it also means that the clay would be very brittle and easily broken, and it would be very difficult to move. But then again, this is magic that we're talking about, so really anything's on the table, which we'll actually get back to that magic idea in a little bit. But first, it's very clear to see that these enemies are at least sturdy enough to stand and kneel, as we see, in their basic pose at the bottom of the well. We see a bunch of them kind of kneeling over. So it's very clear that there's some sort of structure here, whether that be the skeleton of somebody inside, or maybe this clay was actually fired and there's some sort of magic allowing it to be malleable and still movable while retaining its structure. Or who knows, maybe it's both. Along this train of thought, it's possible that these may have been used to punish criminals. Basically, you'd encase them in clay, bind their hands behind them or whatever, and then just throw them into a giant oven, basically to act as sort of a kiln, and then you use these masks to place over the top to kind of cover up this gruesomeness that went on inside while still allowing the fire to fully get in there and, really just do some damage on that body of the criminal. If they're punishing criminals, they're probably alive at this point too. Again, there's really no proof to prove any of this, but my mind does like to wander sometimes, and when we're talking about ReDeads, I just immediately assume the worst. This is the royal family we're talking about after all. So then there's actually the idea that the ReDeads are actually made entirely of clay and were made as some sort of a disposable army. Think of where we actually find the ReDead. It's usually in fairly moist areas where clay would actually be kept from hardening and becoming brittle. This would allow, some kind of magic maybe to control these ReDeads as, these brainless kind of soldiers marching forward anyway. And when you think about the implications of this whole, giant army of these brainless monsters, and the fact that there's really no one around to claim the ReDead, kinda hints that maybe this didn't work out too well for the individuals involved in actually making this army. There is kind of one interesting real-world tidbit about clay, and this whole idea of a clay army in general, and that's that the ReDead are actually weak to fire. So, if they were some sort of clay structure brought to life by some kind of dark magic, basically exposing them to enough heat would effectively fire them as if they were being put into a kiln and make them too stiff and brittle to actually move. And then when they tried, they'd either not be able to because they didn't have the strength, because if you think your entire body has just been hardened to the point where you wouldn't be able to move, and even if you did move, say like it didn't, you didn't fire all the way through, you would effectively break off your arm or leg or whatever you're trying to move there. So it kind of makes sense as to why the ReDead would be weak to fire if they in fact are entirely made out of clay. Now personally, I don't really like this idea because they seem to have some capacity to make noise. You know, that horrifying shriek that we all are afraid of as children. Some of us are still afraid of it today actually, but that's beside the point. And if you recall, we don't actually see them move when they do this, so it seems relatively clear, at least in Ocarina of Time, that they're probably using their mouth to make this noise. This would imply that there is someone in there with a set of lungs. I mean, otherwise, how else would air be able to enter and leave the body quickly enough to make that horrible noise? It kind of implies that maybe there's someone, like, the ReDead and the person inside are actually two different entities, which kind of brings these two ideas together. You know, maybe there's a person inside who is the one that has to sustain themselves, and they're the ones that can make this horrifying shriek, and they have this shell that's basically forcing them to do, you know, this guard work, or whatever these ReDead actually were built for, assuming they are made of clay, and aren't just some tortured souls, which I'm still pretty sure is actually the case, but Nintendo, you can retcon however you want, totally up to you. And kind of following along the idea that, you know, maybe the ReDead and the person inside are actually two different entities, is that we never see the ReDead inhale. This kind of implies that maybe the clay is already fired, and it's actually like a tough surface, and the person inside, because admittedly it is just a game, and we'll go over another idea that I actually like a lot better than this whole breathing thing that the ReDeads might or might not be able to do to create noise later on, but it would also kind of explain why they can't keep their prey terrified with their horrifying shriek while they are attacking, as in biting. I mean, you can't shriek if your mouth is full, because that's goddamn rude, okay? Your mama taught you better than that. I can't personally think of many implications as to why the individual inside of the ReDead and the ReDead themselves would be separate, other than maybe as some form of torture. You know, this clay may serve some kind of magical purpose to actually keep the person inside alive well into their life expectancy, effectively prolonging any kind of torture that may have been done to them. But again, this is all very circumstantial, and there's really no proof to support it, but still, it's kind of fun to think about it. While we're here, let's go crazy with the possibility that maybe this isn't even an audible sound that they make. You know, that horrifying shriek? Maybe it's not a sound that you can actually hear. Maybe this is some kind of mental trigger that the ReDead can cause to completely disable their prey. And to be honest, I rather like this tangent because it doesn't require any kind of complicated, well, there's someone suffering inside to make the air and make the noise, but the shell on the outside is hard and gooey and it's like a candy that you'd like to eat because it's hard on the outside but soft on the inside. That's another one of those weird comments, Newbornkilik. Okay. Anyway, but I rather like this idea. Again, this would remove the need to move air and create sound and explain why Link, you know, the Hylian with the Triforce of Courage, is suddenly frozen solid with fear. He's literally had his ability to fight back removed by this mental trigger. He can do nothing. And while we're here, at least the ones in Ocarina of Time seem to have some kind of, like, reality-bending properties to their shriek. They can literally freeze you mid-air, defying gravity. In later games, I do believe this was removed, most notably in Wind Waker. I don't think they can do this. I could be wrong about that. But I know in Ocarina of Time, say you try to do a backflip away from them, they will freeze you in midair. It doesn't matter where you are. But that's kind of a theory for a whole nother time, honestly, and I could probably go into that for a while. The reality-bending ReDeads that Ocarina of Time apparently thought they needed to include because they weren't terrifying enough. So those are some of my ideas. In short, the ReDeads are a complete mess of an enemy that we really don't have much information on. And when magic is involved, it can be difficult to pin down their composition with the real-world applications of clay, because clay honestly is not that impressive. Personally, my favorite idea here would be the fact that maybe they're criminals, you know, tortured criminals that were cast in clay and buried with the masks on their face to mark them as criminals. And while I really wanted to say that these criminals were most likely fired alive, just because my mind likes to assume the worst out of the royal family, there's just a lot wrong with this idea. The fact that we find ReDead in mostly wet areas, and their weakness to fire strongly hints that they are effectively being fired as if they were in a kiln, leads me to believe that the clay is probably still mushy. And if the clay were fired, then they might actually be more resistant to fire than weak to it. But when you think about it, If they were made of unfired clay, it means that at some point these enemies may have been much more common before eventually most of them would have just dried out and crumbled to the ground. Although again, this is magic we're talking about, so that may not be the case. Really, anything is on the table. But yes, if you want my personal opinion on most of these ideas that I've been sharing with you, I like the fact that they might be some tortured criminals in mushy clay, brought to life through some magic, and this shriek is kind of a mental trigger thing that they have, so maybe they pick a certain target, and that target is actually the only thing that ever hears this shriek. But now we must address the elephant in the room, and that is the Gibdo. Yes, when you burn off the wraps of a Gibdo, most notably in Ocarina of Time, they just become a regular ReDead. Now, if we borrow the idea from earlier about the disposable army, it could be that eventually the ReDead were wrapped in wet cloth to effectively lengthen their usefulness above ground. But that's just kind of the Occam's razor of this whole situation. It's the simplest solution, wrap them in some wet cloth, they're completely disposable anyway, and the amazing thing about clay is that it is reusable, assuming it has not yet been fired. It can still be put down into the mush and reused, so you would effectively have 0 casualties as long as you could go out and collect the rest of the clay on the field. It's the perfect army idea, and if they really were made of clay completely all the way through, I must commend the individual who actually thought of this, because it's a great idea. Of course, this is all speculation and just a fun train of thought that I had one night. If you have any ideas about these ReDead or anything else in Ocarina of Time, or any Zelda for that matter, let me know. Maybe I can have a nice train of thought video about that as well. Really quick, I'd like to give a shout out to my patrons, George Kazan III, Mark Comer, Emai, Milanus, Jennifer Campney, Ryan Ellison, and a newcomer. He goes by the name of Cap. So thank you so much everyone for your support, and if you would like to support me, Newbornkilik, as well, making awesome theories and amazing, top-notch, professional level, I can't even joke, professional, quote-unquote, level gameplay videos, then let me know by, leaving a like on the video, or maybe supporting me on Patreon. Anyway, thank you so much for watching all the way to the end, it helps me out an awful lot. I'm Newbornkilik, and I will see you in the next one. I'm out.